Hello everyone. Today we bring you a touching story about Ly Tu Diep, a woman abandoned by her husband's family, struggling to survive with her child. Amid hardship and poverty, she unexpectedly crosses paths with James, a successful businessman. Will fate change her destiny? Let's dive into the story now. As dawn broke, faint sunlight stretched across the endless terrace fields, blending with the misty morning fog. Ly Tu Diep crouched on the hillside, her small hands carefully picking bundles of vegetables and placing them into a bamboo basket. Behind her, a child slept soundly in a sling, breathing steadily but with dry, parched lips. Occasionally, the child stirred and let out a soft whimper, making her heart ache. Diep looked at her child, her eyes filled with sorrow. She once had a family, but after being driven away by her husband's family, she had nothing left except this child. Beside her, an older woman was also picking vegetables, occasionally glancing at Diep with sympathy. "Are you and your child out picking vegetables to sell again?" the woman asked, her hands swiftly plucking green stalks. Diep nodded slightly, forcing a smile, but it was as faint as the morning sunlight. "Is there anyone in the village hiring workers, sister?" she asked softly, her voice tinged with hope. The woman shook her head and sighed. "Times are tough lately, but if you're willing to try, head down to the village. Maybe someone needs help." Diep bit her lip, her gaze drifting into the distance. She had no other choice but to go. She adjusted the sling carrying her child, tightened the basket of vegetables on her shoulder, and walked alongside the woman. Ahead of them, a rugged red dirt road led down to the village, stretching like Diep's uncertain fate. After walking a while, Diep suddenly stopped. In front of her, a man lay sprawled on the road, reeking of alcohol. An empty liquor bottle rolled on the rocky ground beside him. Diep's eyes flashed with fear. That man was her ex-husband. The drunkard mumbled incoherently, occasionally bursting into wild laughter like a madman. His appearance was that of a man who had given up on life. A deep, firm voice rang out from behind. "Hey, you can't lie here. Get up." Diep turned around abruptly. A tall man in a black suit stood there, his gaze cold and piercing. James, a young businessman who had just arrived in the area to survey the market. He bent down, his sharp eyes fixed on the drunkard. "Don't you know how dangerous it is to lie in the middle of the road?" Diep's ex-husband lazily opened his eyes, glaring at James, then suddenly sneered. "You know what? That woman, she's my ex-wife. Are you trying to steal her from me?" James glanced at Diep. She was bowing her head, her hands clutching her child tightly, trying to hide her trembling. The drunkard continued to laugh wildly, pointing at James. "You liked her before, didn't you?" The tension thickened. Diep wanted to run, but her legs felt frozen. James calmly stood up, ignoring the drunkard, and said softly, "You're only humiliating yourself." With that, he helped the man up and pushed him aside. Diep didn't dare linger. She held her child and quickly walked away, unaware that James was still watching her retreating figure. The hot, dry wind swirled around the rooftops, carrying dust along the narrow path leading to the village market. The noise of vendors, the squeals of pigs, and the clucking of chickens blended together, creating a bustling yet chaotic scene. Ly Tu Diep walked slowly, hugging the corner of the road to avoid bumping into the porters carrying goods. Her hands tightly gripped the straps of her basket, her heart anxious with uncertainty about whether she would find work. She stopped in front of a produce stall, where large sacks of potatoes were piled high in the corner of the market. A middle-aged woman was busily tidying up, her rough hands swiftly rearranging bundles of fresh greens. Taking a deep breath, Diep mustered her courage and spoke up. "Miss, I'm looking for work. Are you hiring?" The woman turned her head, her sharp eyes scanning Diep from head to toe. She looked at her with a scrutinizing gaze, then clicked her tongue. "What can you do?" "I'm strong. I can help carry goods, sort items, clean up. I can do anything." Diep's voice trembled, but her eyes were determined. The woman thought for a moment, then pointed to a pile of heavy taro sacks lying haphazardly in the corner of the storeroom. "If you want to work, carry these inside." Diep bent down, trying to lift one of the sacks. The bag was too heavy, her back felt like it was about to break, but she clenched her teeth and persevered. Nearby, some of the vendors glanced at her with disdainful looks. "Look at her, so frail. She probably can't even lift it." How can she handle such hard labor? Diep gritted her teeth, biting her lip until it bled, but she refused to give up. Finally, after a struggle, she managed to carry the first sack into the storeroom. In the distance, James leaned against a wall, quietly observing everything. His eyes flickered with a hint of confusion. Why would a woman like her have to endure such hardship? The sky turned a pale gray, then quickly faded into darkness. The noise of the market gradually subsided, leaving only a few scattered vendors tidying up their stalls. Diep stood in a corner of the market, her trembling hands counting the few coins in her palm. This money was only enough to buy a dry loaf of bread. She walked into a small stall, bowing her head. "Ma'am, can I have a loaf of bread?" The vendor looked at her, noticing her haggard appearance, and felt a pang of pity. But she silently handed over a loaf of bread without a word. Taking the bread, Diep turned and left, disappearing into the descending night. With nowhere to go, she wandered to the edge of the forest, searching for a hidden spot to rest for the night. The cold wind pierced through the thin layers of her clothing. She reached a small clearing under the trees, bent down to gather dry branches, and slowly lit a small fire. The flickering flames illuminated her weary face. She sat huddled, holding her young child, who was fast asleep in her arms. The child nestled closer to her mother, tiny hands clutching her clothes as if afraid of being abandoned. Diep gently patted her child's back, whispering softly, "Sleep, my child. Tomorrow will be better." But even she didn't know if tomorrow would truly be any better. In the distance, on a high hill, a figure silently observed everything. James. He stood there, his pensive gaze fixed on the small, flickering fire amidst the darkness. How much longer could she endure? Though James wasn't one to pay attention to others, there was something about this girl that he couldn't look away from. Perhaps it was the fragility yet resilience in her eyes. Perhaps it was her small, lonely figure in the cold night. Or maybe he had seen too many people like her but had never truly cared. For the first time, he didn't want to turn his back and walk away. The mountain wind howled, cutting through the trees and bringing a biting cold. The night sky was filled with stars, but there was no warmth to be found. At the edge of the forest, a small flame flickered in the darkness, dancing with the wind. Diep sat there huddled, her arms tightly holding her sleeping child. Her eyes were dry, staring at the weak flame. Her heart felt like that flame, fragile, trembling, and ready to extinguish at any moment. In front of her was only a dry, hard loaf of bread. She peeled off the crust, broke off a small piece, and slowly chewed. The bread was dry, but it was the only thing keeping her hunger at bay. She held her child close, pressing her cheek against the soft hair, trying to preserve the little warmth left. Suddenly, soft footsteps sounded behind her. Diep turned sharply, her eyes wide with alarm, her body tense. In the dim light of the fire, a tall figure stood there. James. He wore a long coat, his figure solid like a wall against the cold night. His face was calm as always, but his eyes held something indescribable. "Have you eaten dinner?" he asked, his voice low but not as cold as before. Diep froze. She didn't understand why he was here or why he cared about her. She tightened the sling around her child, trying to hide the fear in her eyes. I'm fine," she stammered, her voice almost lost in the wind. James sighed softly, then slowly approached. He placed a paper bag in front of her. Diep looked at the bag, not daring to reach for it. She was wary, her eyes filled with doubt. Seeing this, James simply shrugged and said lightly, "No one can survive alone forever. Let me help you." Diep remained silent. She didn't know how to react to this sudden kindness. James stood there for a few seconds, then turned and walked into the night. The wind carried his figure away, leaving Diep sitting there, still stunned. She looked down at the paper bag, hesitating for a long time. Finally, she slowly opened it. Inside was a soft loaf of bread, a bottle of warm water, and some food. As the aroma of the bread hit her, her stomach growled fiercely. She bit her lip, her hands trembling as she broke off a piece. As she took a bite, tears streamed down her face. Not because the bread was delicious, but because it had been so long since she had a warm meal like this. The fire still burned, but it was dying down. Diep stared at the glowing embers, her arms wrapped around her knees. She had finished eating, but the warmth in her heart kept her restless. Why did he help her? She didn't understand. From a young age, she had learned not to trust anyone. The people she had once trusted, her husband's family, the man she once called her husband, had all abandoned her without hesitation. She didn't need anyone's pity. But why did this act of kindness make her cry? The sound of soft footsteps pulled her out of her chaotic thoughts. She looked up. James was still there. He hadn't left. He had stayed. "Do you plan to keep wandering like this tomorrow?" he asked calmly, though his tone was hard to read. Diep bit her lip, not answering immediately. James slowly sat down on a nearby rock, crossing his arms. "I need someone to help me," he said, his tone not forceful. "If you're willing, you can come work for me." Diep's eyes widened. She hadn't expected this offer. Why are you helping me?" she whispered, her voice as soft as the wind. James looked at her for a long moment, then simply said, "Because I don't like seeing anyone abandoned." His words were gentle, but they made her heart tighten. She bowed her head, her mind in turmoil. James stood up, brushing the dust off his coat, then said one last thing. "You don't have to decide now. Rest. Tomorrow, I'll still be here." With that, he turned and walked away. Diep sat there, silently watching his figure fade into the distance, her eyes filled with confusion. What should she do? Tomorrow, should she accept his offer? Or should she continue on her own path? The flame before her flickered, much like her heart, torn between the past and a new future.